Hi, I'm Hilary Weaver. Welcome to my presentation. I have a PowerPoint that I would like to share with you today. Let me bring this up. And let me start it from the beginning. So my topic for today is recognizing coloniality, a prerequisite to co-building a new eco-social world. I'm very happy to be with you here today at the conference, even though it is virtual. I'm looking forward to the day when we will be together. If anyone is interested in contacting me after seeing this presentation, my contact information is here on this first slide. Again, my name is Hilary Weaver. I'm at the University at Buffalo School of Social Work, and there is my email address for you to see. My first slide, I always acknowledge my children, my daughter Iris and my son Wambly the eagle. I would also like to acknowledge the lands that we are all on today. We are in different places. So I encourage you to think of whose land you are on. The world is built on Indigenous lands. I am in Western New York State in the United States. This purple image at the bottom of my PowerPoint here, some of you may recognize as the Hiawatha Belt, which can be read as a map from west to east of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I am on Haudenosaunee lands, specifically Onondaga lands, the western door of the Confederacy, also known as Seneca Territory. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I happen to come to this topic today. I am Lakota. We are one of the indigenous peoples of what is now the United States. We're one of the larger groups, and we're from the Great Plains area of the United States, around South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, into Wyoming, those areas, if you're familiar with them. But I have lived in Haudenosaunee territory for the majority of my adult life. And I am adopted into the Seneca Beaver clan. I've raised my children in the longhouse here. You see this picture of us when my children were a bit smaller, dancing at a powwow here in Haudenosaunee territory. Although powwows are part of my tradition as a Lakota person. It's a way that I rejuvenate, replenish, retain who I am as an Indigenous person living in a largely non-Indigenous society. I live in the city of Buffalo, New York, and I've raised my children here. Another central part of my identity is that I'm a social worker. And much of what I have done throughout my social work career is to try and help my chosen profession be responsive to diverse peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples. So I'm the interpreter, the translator between my profession and its Western roots and Indigenous peoples. So the theme for the conference is building a new eco-social world. And I think that's a really, really important topic. So I wanted to share with you my thoughts on how we go about doing that. A quick overview of the things that I'm going to touch on today. I'm going to talk about colonization and how that's really the root of dehumanization, exploitation, commodification of the natural world, as well as commodification of people. So many of the problems that we grapple with in today's world, I do think have a colonial root. I think it's important to recognize that root if we're really going to make a difference in dismantling oppressive structures. If we don't recognize that root, the change that we do will only be cosmetic or surface changes. And we as social workers want to do better. We want to change this world and leave no one behind. I'm going to wrap up my presentation with a couple of specific examples that I think illuminate how historical and ongoing injustice do come from that colonial root, because I think we have to raise that awareness to move toward real change. So that's a quick overview of the things that I intend to talk with you about. I think colonization is an insidious problem. I think it's deeply rooted, and it is so much a fabric of today's world that we may be oblivious to it. It may be invisible. But colonization has really facilitated objectification, dehumanization, and exploitation of people and of the natural world as well. It's structural, and these colonial structures are grounded in assertions of superiority, that some people are better than others because of their race or because of their gender. These structures are very much entwined with economics and with culture as well. I really appreciated this cartoon that I've included here on this slide, because I think it really does capture what I'm trying to say. That on one side, you see our blessed homeland as compared to their barbarous wastes, our glorious leader as compared to their wicked despot, our great religion as compared to their primitive superstition, our noble populace as compared to their backward savages, our heroic adventurers as compared to their brutish invaders. You know, it's really two sides of the same coin. And I think that this image really depicts these assertions of superiority and how they can be pretty baseless, and but yet they're deemed to be truth. These are the things that have fed colonization. If we think we are better than somebody else, then we can supplant them. We can take their territories because they're not really using them very well. We can use them much more effectively. Or perhaps they just have these vast lands that are barely occupied. These are justifications for colonization. Some of these other images I have are things like manifest destiny and how civilization might even be divinely ordained or justified, that we take somebody else's land and we extract their resources and we enslave people to do it. These are all part of colonial endeavors. And, you know, I mentioned that I'm a social worker, but I think all of us, social workers included, need to understand economics and need to understand how corporations and corporate entities like the East India Company have always been deeply entwined with colonization. It's not so much that one individual goes and tries to take another's land. It's not even so much that one country or nation would try to supplant another. Corporations have been deeply invested in seeking profits, and they have played a key role in colonization. So as we think about colonization or colonialism, we need to be clear that we're not just talking about an event. Because if it were an event, we could think of it as past tense rather than a structure that is ongoing. That's part of the problem if we think of it as an event. It is indeed a structure. And it is not just a thing of the past. These ideas of superiority, they haven't gone away. They haven't vanished with the passage of time. Economic forces, notably capitalism, these continue to support the colonial structures. So it may not necessarily be companies like the East India Company that are exploiting territories. It may be different companies now. And it's often a partnership between for-profit entities and the governments that support them, that allow them. The underlying values that legitimated colonization, they still inform our societal institutions, and they keep going and they keep going and they keep going. So we see these today in things like prisons, and large numbers of Indigenous people and people of color locked up in prisons in places like the United States and Canada. In some places of the world, colonial powers, or the original colonial powers like England and France and the Netherlands and Italy, they've withdrawn from places like Africa and Asia. But that doesn't mean that the colonial structures have gone away. The tensions and the disparities remain between the descendants of settlers and those indigenous to the land, long after the occupying forces have withdrawn. And of course, in places like the United States and Canada, the descendants of the settlers are not going anywhere. There's no pretense that the colonial powers have left. Things have just changed hands from Great Britain to the United States and Canada. And I do believe that one of our worst problems is internalized colonization, because we don't necessarily need external entities to keep us in line anymore. After generations of colonization, we often buy into the colonial narrative that we're not as good, that our oppression is justified by somebody else's superiority. And so we often engage in lateral violence that reinforces this colonial dominance. If we believe that we are not as good as somebody else, then we're doing the work of the colonizer. And that is perpetuated in Indigenous communities, amongst other marginalized peoples. We have absorbed these beliefs and practices, and sometimes we devalue our own cultures. So this internalized colonization is particularly insidious and destructive. So we need to see what is going on. If we don't see it, if we don't acknowledge the root causes of problems, then we cannot make a meaningful difference. We need to recognize the impact of ongoing colonial structures, and that's relevant for all of us in our shared society. I'm not just talking about Indigenous people. Some things are more visible than others, like this picture, very colonial picture of Africans transporting a European. It's clear who's in charge in that picture. But we need to recognize that injustice is ongoing, and that colonization is both the foundation for and an expression of racism and bigotry. We need to look hard to see the things that may not be obvious about how colonization continues. This other image I have here relates to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. There are many problems with violence against women, all kinds of women. But some disappearances get much more attention than others. For instance, in Canada, there are thousands of Indigenous women who have gone missing. But yet when a non-Indigenous woman goes missing, when a white woman goes missing, there's much more attention that that garners. And that's what this image is communicating. Women who go missing are not equal. Some get a lot more attention than others, and it should be an issue of concern to each and every one of us. Dehumanization of anybody threatens everybody. This is a problem for all of us in our shared world. In the United States, I've heard a lot of people talk about an age of reckoning. A couple of years ago, George Floyd, an unarmed African-American man, was murdered at the hands of police. And so many people said, okay, this is going to be a time of change. We are on the cusp of significant societal change. I think the same has been said in other places in the world, that when injustice and violence become so visible, it will be the last time. We will learn our lesson. We will do better. I'm a little bit skeptical, and I wish I wasn't. I think it remains to be seen whether this really is an age of reckoning, whether we really are going to be better. I think the roots of racism and colonialism are so insidious. They are so invisible. I would like to think that we're going to recognize them and pull these things up by the roots and really address them. But I'm not sure. I want to be a part of co-building a new eco-social world. I love the theme of the conference. I think in order to do that, we must recognize and reconcile with the unjust foundations of our societies. It cannot just be a surface or cosmetic change. We must acknowledge how colonialism or colonization continues to undergird our contemporary realities. It didn't go away. It's not a thing of the past. It's embedded in our structures. It is our foundation for millions of people around the globe. That's why I put a picture of a foundation here. If our foundation is corrupt or rotten, it doesn't matter what we put on top of it. It will be faulty. We need to recognize the problems with our foundation. We cannot simply build on top of it, or the house will continue to topple over. We must raise our awareness. I'm in the United States. Here, the United States likes to present itself as a beacon of democracy, equality, and religious freedom. Well, some of us know that that has never been the case. As an Indigenous person, I know that for many generations, Indigenous religions were banned, even though the United States claimed it was this bastion of religious freedom. There are example after example of inequality continuing in the United States. I don't think we can hold ourselves up as better than other countries. I think people still try to do that in the United States and say the problems are elsewhere, but we need to clean our own house as well. In this so-called age of reckoning, people were taking down statues that were deemed offensive, largely statues related to the Confederacy. These statues have been removed. They were declared vestiges of an irrelevant past. But I think that ignores the significant festering and ongoing divisions in US society. And who decides which statues come down? Statues of George Washington remain, statues of Andrew Jackson largely remain. And both of those were very divisive figures. You know, George Washington was a slaveholder who tried to eradicate all Indigenous people from what is now New York State. Andrew Jackson removed Indigenous peoples from the southeastern United States. We need to be careful about who we honor and who we deem to be our heroes. We need to be careful about the choices we make about which statues come down and which remain, because it's really just the tip of the iceberg. These are just some symbols. The deep roots of racism and oppression remain in the United States. I like the article by Jackson, who notes that colonization employs a type of myth-making. I think myth-making is a really good way to think of it. And the myth of the United States obscures the horrors of colonization. And they make it appear that things are more benign here, and it reduces state culpability. It lets the United States off the hook. But remaining oblivious to these deep structural colonial divisions, that leaves injustice safely in place. And some of you may remember the classic song by the Cree singer and activist Buffy St. Marie from 1966. My country, 'tis of thy people, you're dying. That was originally about the United States. A few years ago, she also released a Canadian version. And she talks about how genocide is basic to the birth of both the United States and Canada. This is our foundation. So I don't think that removing Confederate statues makes a difference in that foundation. I'm concerned that it's a surface gesture that doesn't challenge the powerful colonial pillars that our society is built on. And here I am in Buffalo, New York. I'm taping this presentation 3 days after a white supremacist deliberately drove to Buffalo, New York, my community, to kill as many Black people as he could. And he targeted a grocery store in a community that had fought long and hard just to even have access to food. It's the only grocery store for miles around in a poor neighborhood where many people just don't even have access to cars. The dynamics that fueled this racially targeted massacre are not new. These are the same dynamics of colonialism, the dehumanization that makes it seem okay for somebody to kill other people who are seen as subhuman or as a threat. It's a painful reminder that these ideas of white supremacy have not vanished. 10 people killed who were shopping on a sunny Saturday afternoon in my community. And now we are all shaken and all feeling threatened about what will happen next. This legacy of colonial settler states, this legacy continues. It's not just about symbols. Colonial history is woven into the social fabric of our society. It's not about outdated images that we can put away or statues that we can take down that don't represent what people are thinking these days. Because these thoughts of racism and bigotry and white supremacy are alive and well in many, many different places. Bias and hate are persistent, and they're tearing apart our societies. Systemic racism is deeply rooted. We must tear it up by the roots. You know, when I go out and I'm working in my garden, I make a joke that my mom used to often make about, you know, I'm making the weeds shorter. because we know that we're not getting at that root. Well, that may be okay if you're just a gardener, but if you want to build a new eco-social role, you better get those roots. You better rethink who your heroes are when countries like the United States celebrate Columbus Day, somebody who played a major role in genocide. You better question environmental racism. You need to question why so many indigenous communities and communities of color do not have access to clean drinking water, or the soil is toxic, or the air is toxic. You need to think about how the rich get richer and the poor get their byproducts. These are the legacy of colonial settler states. And we must raise awareness. Truth is important. We must look at these ongoing colonial foundations and recognize them as relevant. It's in the United States, it's elsewhere. Only when we recognize these things are we free to make different choices. We can't keep building on those same foundations and expect a different outcome. We must build new foundations. We must raise the visibility and awareness of these insidious colonial structures. That is a core element that we must do to foster equity and justice for all people. Again, it's not just Indigenous peoples, it's all of us. And I'm going to share 2 examples of raising awareness that I'm very proud to be a part of. One was social work specific. I was involved with writing a statement of accountability for our social work profession. It's a very long document that documents historically and also contemporary actions of social workers in terms of Indigenous people, how we have harmed people, particularly in things like child welfare systems and healthcare systems with policies. Recognizing the role of my chosen profession in harming Indigenous people, that's a building block in moving my profession forward. If we acknowledge how racism and bias have undermined our commitment to social justice, when we recognize that, we can make a choice to do better. And to be clear, what social workers have done with Indigenous people is mirrored in how we have perpetuated injustice with other peoples as well. We must acknowledge our actions, past and present, in oppressing racialized and marginalized peoples of all kind. A second project documenting truth is a mural project that is happening right now at a place called El Buen Amigo, which is a store of fair trade goods founded by Santiago Masferrer. This is him standing in front of his store. He came from Chile in the 1970s as a refugee from the Pinochet regime, where he had been imprisoned for mobilizing people and promoting recycling, of all things. His store is in a prominent location in my city of Buffalo, New York, and he has a vision to create a mural that documents the genocide of Indigenous peoples, the genocide of the natural world, the role of women. It's going to be a vibrant public mural project that will be right in the face of many, many people who don't want to recognize these truths. There's a flyer here. The mural project is ongoing right now. So there's a fundraiser next week to buy paint for the mural. My role was helping to document the truth of genocide. So when people come to him and say that didn't happen, I was able to provide pages and pages and pages of documentation. Yes, it did happen. forcing residents to grapple with the brutality inherent in the social fabric of the United States. As I wrap up, I want to emphasize again, it's essential to deepen our understanding of these colonial foundations and how they continue to support ongoing dehumanization and oppression. It's only when we recognize these foundations that we are free to really, truly co-build a new eco-social world and leave no one behind. These two projects, one written and one a large work of art, remind us of these colonial foundations and challenge us to thoughtfully find our way forward. As I wrap up my presentation, I encourage you to consider some of these resources that I've cited today. I thank you for listening to my words. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you at a future conference in person. Thank you.